conventionally trained pediatric neurologist as well as an herbalist. She's the author of The Dirt Cure, and this book is excellent. Dr. Mark Hyman calls it a game changer for children's health, so definitely a book to check out. In her bio, Dr. Maya says she loves to geek out over brain and mitochondria and science, but she also is in full service to our Mother Earth and to the spirit and to the sacred. So I cannot wait to hear her insights today. If you're joining us on live stream, so you know, we'll have the link in the comments so that you can register for the event, and that way you can join us live after Dr. Maya wraps her talk for a Q&A with Dr. Maya. So now, Dr. Maya, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here, and I'm thrilled to get to spend time with all of these health-minded people and to talk about some cutting-edge science around nature. So I'm going to share my slides here, and all right. So I just want to start by thinking about community, because as we've seen for these last few years, our communities have been closed down, they've shifted, they've changed. Probably most of you can think practically about you know, people maybe that you didn't see for a long time, whether professionally, personally, people that you no longer communicate with. Things have shifted and changed a lot. And a lot of what we've thought about during that time is community, is about community and what that can mean for our health and our well-being. So we're going to go from macro to micro over the course of this talk, right? Thinking about what community is. And, you know, just to kind of touch on that, community has a lot of different definitions. It could be a group of people living in the same place or having a particular characteristic, a feeling of fellowship, sharing common attitudes, interests, and goals, a particular area or place that is together with its inhabitants. So community can be something more than just people, or a feeling or a common interest, but actually being in community with place. And then it can be a group of interdependent organisms growing or living together in a specified habitat. So, you know, to get to this idea of what is community or what is relationship, right? It's being in relationship with yourself and those around you, being in relationship with the land that you stand on, being in relationship with the living beings around you. And we will even go deeper to say those living beings or those beings could be visible or invisible, right, to naked eye. So here we'll say community is this ongoing exchange of visible and invisible connections between interconnected groups that help us, hopefully, to be more resilient. And I got interested in this particularly because I always was fascinated by, as a physician, seeing people who could have the same exact kind of challenges, right? Whether it be Lyme or COVID or, you know, any number of different toxic exposures, right? And then one of them would be completely fine, just, you know, walk off into the sunset, no issues. Another might have kind of been knocked off course a little, but rights themselves quickly. Another person's really knocked off the horse, right? They struggle for a long time to get back on, but eventually they do. And some people can never get back on the horse. And I wanted to understand what's happening in those people, what makes them resilient or not resilient. And what it came down to was understanding community within them and around them, right? And we have this word, Ubuntu, I am because we are, right? We're only who we are because of our interactions and our connections. And the world actually works in communities. If you think about schools of fish, swarms of bees, mycelial networks, right? This wood wide web that's underground, that's connecting forests. Forests themselves are communities, we're learning, and even the microbiome, right? The organisms that live in and on our body, right? And a school of fish can do what one fish can't. Similarly, trees work in harmony to even share their sunlight, right? And their other resources as well. Because we're a series of communities within communities within communities. And that goes all the way to our cells and mitochondria and microbes, as we will be discussing today. So I will refer to myself as me, probably you do too, but really I should refer to myself as we, because we are an entire being with many, many, many communities. And really, if we look at the microbiome, we could talk about almost universes within us. So this old idea of the human body where we wanted to label and kind of dissect everything out, this very reductionist view is all these different separate organs that are kind of in their own, you know, canister. And we have these specialists who do brain or who do heart or who do intestine. And of course, there's value to a more reductionist approach. But actually, all the way from ancient times, there has been an idea of this greater communal approach, even within the body, this sense that everything is connected. And this is the Chinese medicine wheel. And I use this frequently in my practice, even though I don't practice primarily traditional Chinese medicine, because you can look at each of these organ systems and they're associated with a time of day, a time of year, a part of the face, an emotion, an element. And you actually can see when I have someone who comes to me 3 to 5 a.m., they're waking up every single night at the same time. I can look and say, oh, okay, that's lung time. Is there something going on with their lungs? That's a grief period also. So are they running into problems with grief? And, you know, I'll ask them, I'll say, have you experienced any issues with grief lately? And they'll say, oh yeah, this is when my mother died. And so every year I really struggle with grief at this time, right? Oh, well, you're waking up at 3 a.m. That's probably connected. And so this sort of way of thinking about how we are these very interconnected beings is not new, actually. It's something very, very old. So to get to this idea of the kinds of communities that we're in, I want to talk just a little bit about dirt, this idea that the foundation of our resilience actually comes from dirt. And what do I mean by dirt, right? So you might know, I wrote a book called The Dirt Cure. And the 3 categories that I had in mind when I said dirt were germs and microbes, soil and what grows in it, and time in nature. And that's kind of expanded even a little bit more, but this is what I'm going to focus on in this talk today. So I want to start with the idea of microbes. And people will often ask me, well, what's the difference between a germ and a microbe? And really all it is that a germ is a pejorative term for a microbe, right? So there was a time way, way back when germ theory began that, there was such anxiety about these invisible organisms that were waiting to kind of like take over our bodies and kill us, that people were too afraid to even eat yogurt and sourdough bread because it was considered contaminated, right? We have this way of having this pendulum that goes to either one extreme or the other. And usually what it has to do with is being in some kind of moderation, right? Being in right relationship. So, this idea of germs versus microbes is that we need to be in right relationship with the microbes and the microbiome of our body. And then we might not have these issues, right, of germs invading, taking over, quote unquote, right? That has been this fear that we've had for a very long time in our society, and, rightly so at times, right? So microbes are actually in symbiotic relationship with us. They determine how our guts work, everything from digestion, absorption, to how well we detoxify, literally how our liver functions, how our gallbladder functions, everything from the beginning to the end, mouth to anus, all is determined to a great extent by the microbes that live there. Microbes balance our hormones. They build neurotransmitters. They regulate our immune systems. They determine our cravings. They regulate our brain and behavior. And microbes, in fact, also help us through their waste products to be nutrient repleted. So vitamin K, B12, and so on are actually made in the metabolic process of microbes in the gut, and we can absorb those. So just to get to this idea of microbes and how they influence our health, the idea of diversity, okay, there was a study long ago that started something called the hygiene hypothesis. And maybe many of you are aware of this. The hygiene hypothesis basically said, if you're too clean, you're going to have more allergies and asthma. And so they said, this kind of came from this New England Journal of Medicine article that said children who grow up on traditional farms are less likely, 30 to 50% less likely than other children to develop asthma. So they said, oh yeah, it's about being clean. And if you're too clean, it's an issue. And so they actually did further studies on this eventually, right? This hygiene hypothesis. And what they found was actually it was not cleaner, right? So if you looked at an urban apartment and you looked at a traditional farm, the number of microbes was actually similar. It was the diversity on the farms of bacteria and fungi that seem to be associated with the low likelihood of asthma. So what we need, what our bodies need, is to be in very, and I say dirty, quote unquote, right, very microbially rich, microbially diverse environments. And we've had this health paradigm that we're coming from for a very long time of avoid, 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 right? It's better, like, and this just kind of came back in full force through COVID, right? Like bleach and hand sanitizer and, don't go near people. I mean, masks and gloves and all of the things. And, it's very interesting because there are studies that came out of Europe over the past several years that looked at increased bleach use in schools or homes. And the more bleach that was used, actually, the more respiratory infections that children had. So it was actually associated with more bronchitis and more respiratory infection rather than the other way around. And we find also that when we wash dishes by hand with the sponges, right, which we think of as being, like covered in bacteria versus putting things in the dishwasher, you are more likely to develop allergies with dishwashers versus using those microbially rich, right, rather than thinking of it as contaminated, microbially rich sponges. Having pets in the house also is associated in young children with having fewer allergies, asthma, and so on later on in life. So this avoid, 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 avoid has, become really enmeshed in our society, but it may not actually be what's best for us, even though there may be times that it could be more appropriate. We know that our flora is different, right? We have these challenges to our microbiome. The way we're born actually changes the nature of our microbiome from the very beginning. And while those things can shift and change over time, if you're born by C-section, you have a gut that's filled more with skin flora than with perineal or vaginal flora, and everyone gets very squeamish when we talk about vaginal flora, but it's what actually seeds the gut of the newborn and helps them have this diverse microbiome. So just as we pass down DNA, and even epigenetics, we also pass down microbes. That's part of our, our birthright, what we receive from our parents and from the environment we live in when we're young. Formula feeding versus breastfeeding similarly challenges the microbiome. Different flora exist in a formula-fed baby versus a breastfed baby. And there's so much very interesting data about this. But one of the main points is that, in breast milk, there's certain components that don't break down and aren't absorbed by the baby, but they simply are there to feed microbes and maintain certain categories of microbes that protect the gut from being too leaky in the baby. Leaky gut's normal in babies, but these organisms are there through breast milk, fed only by breast milk. And when breast milk ends, those microbes are no longer there to protect that leaky gut in the infant. Things like chronic use of antibiotics, things like acetaminophen, ibuprofen, steroids, vaccines, other pharmaceuticals all contribute to changing and challenging the microbiome. And we don't even know all the ways that happens because some of those things are just not well studied, but more and more they are being studied. Things like processed food and pesticides also challenge the microbiome. And of course, too much time indoors. So it turns out, we thought we were going to have this magic bullet for how we were going to solve all chronic illness. And we thought it was going to come from DNA. And that ended up kind of being a bust. It turned out, learning genetics is not going to solve every problem that we have, right? Because that magic bullet model that we're going to figure out the problem, make the drug, solve the problem, pretty much an outdated model. Biodiversity is that new magic bullet, okay? The more organisms and the more exposures and the more kind of natural messiness, right? The messiness is actually the magic bullet. And the biodiversity our bodies need to be healthy actually comes from our terrain. So this idea that we've had for a very, very long time, that it's us versus them, whether it's, us versus other communities or us versus the organisms that, are going to come and invade our body and so on, probably not really how we're going to solve our problems, right? It's actually a me, not versus we actually, but a me and we approach, thinking about ourselves and thinking about ourselves in community. So I love this quote by John Muir. When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. So this is really what we need to be thinking about now. So let me get a little to the science here of, I'm saying a lot of interesting things maybe, or a lot of maybe controversial things, right? Let's talk about what the science says. So I don't know if you've heard of psychobiotics, but this idea of psychobiotics, and I love that they're calling it poop pills, because I did pediatric neurology for a very long time, and poop was a normal part of my daily conversation with patients. But poop pills and probiotics could be game changers for mental illness. Think about this, okay? Turns out that the organisms that live in our gut are actually influencing our mood. And in fact, things like fecal transplant, which is exactly what it sounds like, poop pills, okay, or enemas, right, as well. And probiotics are ways to shift our gut flora and change our mental health. Another idea is that Parkinson's begins in the gut, right? So more and more we're seeing these brain disorders. Multiple sclerosis also is thought to have connection to the hygiene hypothesis, right? So the microbiome is very connected to MS. Type 2 diabetes as well has gut microbiome dysbiosis as a really important component. And in fact, there's really interesting data that came out of an Aboriginal community where they showed that people who had parasite infections in the past had 61% less likelihood of developing type 2 diabetes. So parasites seem to in some way be protective, right? And actually it turns out that parasites are also in some way part of this gut microbiome. So this is, very fascinating stuff. Cancer and cancer immunotherapy, the gut microbiome does have an influence on cancer, on our immune systems, and on how well cancer immunotherapy can work. And even looking at longevity. So we're actually seeing that gut microbiome is related to low-grade inflammation that's chronic, and that actually influences older adults in terms of their frailty level. So, you can look at an elder and say, well, is this person more resilient, more frail? There's like the 80-year-old who's off doing CrossFit, right? And then there's like the other people that are, having a hard time walking. And gut microbiome is actually a big part, right? The diversity of flora and the health of those flora actually has to do with longevity and with living your full life with high quality. And even looking at the gut-bone axis, that bacterial metabolites actually are part of what's in that dynamic relationship of the bone. Again, the gut-lung axis. So we're talking about every organ system is in communication with microbes and metabolites that are coming from the gut. And we're learning that this isn't just bacteria, it's also viruses. So we're learning that there's actually viruses that live in the gut and in the body that actually take over for bacteria. So you get antibiotics and that can cause a lot of problems for you, even up to a year or even up to 4 to 6 years, your gut microbiome would be different. Viruses actually, it's been shown, and some of the articles have even been published in Nature, actually step in and help kind of bridge the gap until the flora can come back to where they were, the bacteria can come back to where they were. And we even see now that these viruses that are living in the body seem to have a educational purpose. So for example, with mumps, which isn't something that we get very much anymore, but that when the body actually experiences mumps, the immune system can recognize the antigen on ovarian cancer better because it's been sensitized through mumps, which has a very similar antigen. So, there's this sense that like we're actually, this idea that viruses are bad, maybe not as bad in many cases as we thought, depending on our terrain. And we're now talking about the microvirome and the mycobiome, which is fungi, and even this idea of parasites and how they relate to things like inflammatory bowel disease and our health in general, right? So I mentioned this idea that parasites can actually be helpful. And here there is this study that says in their conclusion that the relationship between human and nematodes, parasites of the gastrointestinal tract, can be considered as a mutualism rather than a typical parasitism, and may be an alternative therapeutic model for IBD, inflammatory bowel disease. So to think about this reframing of parasites as being more a mutualism is really, really, I think, exciting and interesting. And of course, we have to go cautiously. We're not looking, people will sometimes ask me when I give talks, should I go like get myself infected with parasites? No, I don't recommend that. But this is emerging science and it's exciting science. And I think it's going to be informing everything about chronic health in the years to come. So it turns out that bacteria are actually in constant conversation with our cells. So bacteria and mitochondria evolved from the same place. Mitochondria actually thought to have evolved from bacteria, and they still communicate with bacteria. Mitochondria exist, if you recall, in every cell in your body, and or almost every cell in your body, and they are kind of known as the energy makers of the cell, like the engines. But they also are sentinels. They're very, very sensitive to what's going on in the cells, and determine much of what happens, including apoptosis, whether the cell decides to live or die. And bacteria on the gut, on the skin, etc., are communicating with mitochondria. So now we understand that is a huge part of how the microbiome is actually having such influence. And we think of mitochondria as being one thing, right? If we were in, high school biology, we think, okay, yeah, I learned about, or eighth grade or whatever, learned about mitochondria. Turns out, right, and I make this joke that it all comes down to spaghetti and meatballs because mitochondrial scientists actually talk about mitochondria as being in different forms. Okay, so no, not all mitochondria look alike. Mitochondria, just like we are very individual in the way that they function and the way they are structured. So they, in healthy mitochondria, they are branched spaghetti, meaning they are branching and communicating and connecting with other mitochondria. So their structure looks like spaghetti. And when they are in stress situations, in cell danger response, where something has come, whether an infection or a toxin or an emotional trauma, they go into meatball mode, where they're no longer connecting. And they are balled up and look exactly like meatballs. Okay? So in these times of cell danger, even our mitochondria are less connected, are less in community with one another. The communication is shut down. It's like wartime mode, right? You harden the borders, you don't trust your neighbors, and then they can't receive. They can't receive the same amounts and kinds of nutrients from their neighbors. They pull back from the network and redirect resources inwards, and it comes at a cost of network function, right? The idea is that for a temporary period of time, it will allow for a greater chance for individual cells to survive. But over time, it can become really problem because cells like to be connected. So even at a mitochondrial level, even at a cellular level, there is this really important connection that has to happen, this community that's happening. And there is this chemical halo that's released in times of stress. We think of ATP and GTP, if you again remember those energy currency, right, made by the mitochondria that power everything in the cell. Those are released into the environment in times of stress, leaky cell membrane, just like we could have leaky gut. And that lets other cells know that there's danger going on. And then those cells start to change hormone production. They start to change cytokine expression, which is how immune cells talk to one another. They even change the way the autonomic nervous system is functioning. So on a cellular level, on a mitochondrial level, the way bacteria are talking to our mitochondria, the way our mitochondria are communicating with one another, and the way cells communicate with each other, that's where it all starts, right? It's all happening on this communal level. There's this universe within us that's all connected. And this is what's actually making all of these chronic changes, acute and chronic changes in our body, for better or for worse. And this is actually happening in the brain as well. So all of this is going on. A cell danger response, right? Again, whatever it may be from, could be, Lyme. It could be from mercury exposure. It could be from something emotional or some kind of major life stress. And it can cause actually cells in the brain, microglia, to be disrupted, to be activated, and cause actual, and I'll just back up here, anything from schizophrenia, major depression, autism, obsessive compulsive disorder, Tourette's, and many others. Alzheimer's. Basically, microglial activation in the brain is kind of the chronic outcome that results from everything, that spaghetti and meatball response being totally dysregulated. That dysregulates, for example, cells in the brain, the microglia, and that's been implicated in psychiatric disease and neurologic disease, pretty much every psychiatric and neurologic disease. So how do you recover from a cell danger response? And the answer is really in our terrain. Terrain is something that's physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, and ecological. So terrain is, we have always kind of thought like, okay, it's our physical health and things we do physically are, what's going to solve the problem because it's a physical problem. Then we kind of said, oh, well, maybe mental health is related too. It turns out emotional health actually matters. And spiritual health is something we're learning more and more about, especially as psychedelics are kind of bridging that gap in our current world. And even ecologically, right? We're connected to the terrain around us. And, we're even learning, right, to the point of the mental and emotional terrain, that we actually hold trauma in our bodies, literally on a cellular level, in our connective tissue. Our nervous systems are different when we look at things like adverse childhood events that we experience that are common, right? Growing up in a family with addiction or divorce or, any kind of abuse, whether physical, emotional, or sexual. All of these things are actually informing us on a cellular level and on a nervous system level. And that does affect our health. And we're seeing that more and more in the science. So our internal terrain is all of these things that we've been talking about: microbiome, gut, skin, lungs, immune system, nervous system, circulatory, lymphatic, and our emotions, right? And so on. And our external terrain, the eco-terrain, we can call it, is the germs and microbes around us: food, soil, air, water, seeds, plants, animals, and other living organisms. The synthetic compounds too that we're exposed to. We could talk about things like EMFs, and the people, right? The people around us are part of our terrain. And we're in community with this terrain that's within us and around us. And everything is connected: microbial health to soil health to plant health to animal health. Everything is informing everything. Everything is connected to everything. Because we are nature, right? And nature is us. And we evolve together. So really what health is finding the alignment between all beings in this web. And I love this picture because is it, I always ask people, what do you think it is, right? Like, what do you think it is? Is it neurons, and dendrites all connecting to one another, synapses in the brain, or is it trees? And it turns out this is actually trees. But you can look at these kinds of pictures and see that there's mirror, right, between what's within us and what's around us, and these patterns that repeat again and again and again in our bodies and in nature. So our job then is to find our place in the web of life through relationship, through partnership, through community, through connectivity. And that can happen in many, many ways. And obviously, it can happen in ways that we ingest, right? And it can happen in ways that we spend our time, and it happens with the supplements, and it happens with the activities. But these are what we need to be thinking about going forward. It's not just, like we can all be in our little capsule doing our thing. It's really about how are we in community with one another. And that's going on literally on a cellular level, on a mitochondrial level, and it's going on obviously on a larger scale as well. And I want to just introduce this idea, if you haven't heard of it, of salugenesis. Salugenesis is the opposite of pathogenesis, right? In medicine, we talk so much about disease processes, right? Pathogenesis, what brings us to disease? And salugenesis is actually not just the opposite of pathogenesis. It's an active and ongoing process that helps us to be more resilient, because it turns out resilience is not a passive state. Wellness is not a passive state. It's an activity. Right? And to have a resilient terrain, we need to be in this active relationship, physically, emotionally, spiritually, creatively, communally, ecologically, to be healthy and to have a sense of well-being. That's really what it's all about, right? It's not that we just don't do things that make us sick. It's about actually doing things that facilitate wellness. Because resilience is actually not just about survival, despite the fact that maybe we have been taught that and we think that. It's about how to survive and thrive. And our well-being really depends upon our ability to nourish ourselves and to live in alignment with the world around us. So let's talk about a few things that can really make a difference there. So food, right? And this is obviously a very, well discussed topic, especially I'm sure for everybody in this crowd. But, I'm going to touch on those things because I never make assumptions. For one thing, having pastured dairy, pastured butter, pastured ghee, right? So if you can get raw, that's wonderful. In some places it's possible, in some places it's not. You always want it to be certified. And I didn't go through the science of why I think raw is important, but there are published studies, mostly out of Europe, that show that it's incredibly beneficial, probably because whey proteins are damaged in pasteurization. So it actually has been shown that children and adults are healthier when they have certified raw, meaning that it's been tested. It's not just, like you're getting it at the side of the road necessarily, but that that it's being regularly tested, and so that it's not contaminated, but that it has healthy numbers of microbes. Pastured meats and eggs. Okay, so pastured meats and eggs, just again, what we know is that when in the same way that our relationships within us are important, our relationships with our food and how our food is raised is really important. How it's grown and how it's raised, right? Like, when we have animals that are living in a way that they are meant to be living out in pasture, eating the grasses and being exposed to the sunlight, and if it's a chicken, scratching and foraging and all of those things, then it changes the meat, it changes the eggs, and then we ingest those meat, eggs, dairy, etc. And those then influence our well-being and our health. Again, physically, mentally, emotionally, and even spiritually. When you eat stressed meat, it actually is very, very different. It's higher in cortisol. People call it dark meat because it is considered to be not as good quality. So understanding that even the well-being of the animals that we're eating affects our well-being. Healthy fats, very, very important. Some people do better with fats and some don't. This isn't like, all of us have individual needs. And I think that is part of the medicine of the future as well, is actually looking more at individual needs of people at different times and phases of their life, looking at gender, looking at seasons, looking at phases of life and transitional times of life. But healthy fats can be critically important because your nervous system is made mostly of fat. It's like as much as 70% fat. And we want to have lots of different kinds of fats too. So diverse fats are critically important and very supportive of the parasympathetic nervous system, hormones, and much, much more in the body. I say minimal fish because ocean ecosystem issues and because a lot of fish basically are contaminated significantly. And I've seen this a lot in my work where there are fish who, people who are eating fish can end up having very high mercury levels, even when it's not high mercury fish, right? Like what we think of like the tuna or the swordfish, even things like salmon. So it varies because we vary, right? Some of us are much better at detoxifying depending on a lot of other factors. But I tend to say to minimize fish in general. Bone broths are excellent in terms of just being much more nourishing than a lot of soups that we could otherwise have. And adding things like medicinal mushrooms, ginger, astragalus are really excellent for boosting your immunity. So all year round, and especially maybe in the colder months, wonderful to have bone broths. Soaking whole grains, nuts, and legumes, fermenting soy, all of those things are really important so that we don't struggle with some of the problems that can come along with nuts, legumes, and grains like lectins and things that we call now anti-nutrients, oxalates as well. You want to be really careful. Again, all of this is really about balance and moderation. Fermenting foods, which anything from dairy, vegetables, drinks, so you're getting probiotics and rich, diverse microbes in your diet. Lots of vegetables, all colors, roots, stems, leaves, the leafy greens, the berries, the spices, okay? And I'm drinking plenty of clean water. I'm not going to get too much into water, but there's a lot of really interesting data on things like deuterium depleted water and on structured water that we're starting to understand that there's, in hydrogen enriched water, that we have a lot of options and ways to think about water to even make water healthier beyond just mineral water, which I do think is, important and valuable. Tea is another wonderful way to incorporate medicine into your and herbal antioxidants into your daily life without it being like taking a supplement. A lot of people are, doing a lot more of that. Raw honey, maple syrup, blackstrap molasses, and date sugar. So thinking about for sweeteners, which we want to do minimally, or at least moderately, we want to make sure that they're nutrient dense, right? Rather than going for kind of the refined sugar. Minimizing caffeine, I don't say none. We actually know that coffee has a lot of benefits. So it's really just kind of finding the right coffee. Preferably, it's going to be organic and looking at things like mold and things like that to make sure it is as non-contaminated as possible, and minimizing processed food. So that's the food, right? And I always love to just bring up the fact that this is probably dandelion, one of the most nutritious and medicinal foods that we can get our hands on. We talk about superfoods and we want to import things from other places. To me, if we could start to recognize and create wonderful products from what is actually right here in our own backyards. Dandelion is an incredible bitter, has whole entire beautiful papers. It prevents cancer. My dog has a tumor, and he's getting huge doses of dandelion every day, among other things, because it has such wonderful data against all different kinds of tumors. So I just encourage you to think about what's right in front of you, what's right outside your door, right in your yard. Spices as well, black cumin seed oil, cinnamon, essential oils. There's just incredible data about these spices that we, think of as something that like, you add like a little sprinkle. Incorporating these into your life all the time is just, it's insurance, and it's putting money in the bank. Similarly with curcumin, coming from turmeric, Just such profound data about its antioxidant benefits. And actually, the gut microbiota is what processes it and makes it more metabolically available. Mushrooms. Gosh, I could talk for a long time about mushrooms. I have a whole lecture on my website and a whole program I do on mushrooms. So medicinal mushrooms are incredibly beneficial. Reishi, chaga, cordyceps, turkey tail. As a side point, I have my dog also on big doses of turkey tail because there's really nice data on turkey tail and cancer. But also with all of these mushrooms, they're just profoundly beneficial. So incorporating these into your diet, into your life. I am a forager, an avid forager. So I should I just foraged a huge, giant puffball mushroom yesterday. It's like the size of my head, and I eat them, right? I don't encourage people to do that unless they know what they're looking for and how to identify them safely. But, engaging with wild plants and wild mushrooms, if you know what you're looking at, is profoundly beneficial. They're probably some of the most nutrient dense foods you can find. And just considering diversity begets diversity. Diverse diet begets diverse microbes. Getting out into nature, getting out into the forest, there's incredible data that it improves sleep, it improves executive function, it improves focus, it improves cortisol levels, it actually boosts anti-cancer proteins and natural killer cells. So it's basically just by spending peaceful time in the forest, you are giving yourself a kind of medicine that no pill, no supplement, and nothing else can really do. The complexity and the profound benefits are unmatched. Okay, so getting out into nature. And yes, the forest is where a lot of this study has been done, because Shinrin-yoku, this practice of forest bathing, is something that's been studied extensively in East Asia. But it actually turns out that, being by the water and being in other nature places and even looking at pictures of nature can improve your cortisol levels, can help with healing, can get people discharged from the hospital just if their room looks out on a tree versus a brick wall. So this is a really profound kind of medicine that we really need to engage with and daily, right? Soil, microbial diversity from soil, but also just grounding and getting into nature. There's a beautiful study looking at Mycobacterium vaccae, where they actually, and I love this so much, fed mice tiny peanut butter sandwiches with Mycobacterium vaccae on it. And these mice, as compared to the ones whose peanut butter sandwiches did not have the Mycobacterium, were able to navigate a difficult maze twice as fast with half of the anxiety. They called it a superhero effect. So getting out into the soil, and really, I do think the soil is, in 1 teaspoon of soil, we have as many organisms as there are people on the planet. And we're only just at the beginning of understanding what these different organisms, how they interact with us and what they can do for us, nervous system, gut, immune system, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot there, a lot of potential in the soil. I want to also just, in closing, bring in some other medicines like laughter, right? This is incredibly important for our resilience, for our microbiome actually to be healthy. We create the terrain through the ways that we interact and spend our time. So things like laughter and even tears can be incredibly important medicine for us. Silence and rest. And I'd love you to think about how often you get that in your life, and do you cultivate that for yourself? Meditation, animals. So I just spent, the morning outside looking at hummingbirds, because I plant all these salvia plants that they love. And so I can watch hummingbirds flying around. I live in New York City. Spending time in nature, right? Being around flowers and things that are beautiful from nature. This actually has profound benefits for your mental health and your emotional well-being. Doing things that bring a sense of wonder and awe. This is also incredibly important and well studied in terms of how it can change your brain and promote neuroplasticity. And of course, I know this has been discussed, but this is something I teach extensively about. And I have a book coming out on this, psychedelics, so microdosing, even quantum dosing. We're launching a product at the end of this month for quantum dosing of psychedelics that's completely legal and very profound in terms of building relationship with the medicines and with each other. So with that, please feel free to reach out to me in the future with any questions or thoughts. And it was my pleasure to share this with you today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mai. Even you were talking about all the beauty in nature, and even just looking at the pictures made me feel a little moment of calm. So that's beautiful. We're basically at time, but I just wanted to ask you quickly, any key takeaways in terms of stress and mental wellness and fostering that wellness that you want to leave us with before we part ways?
I mean, I think that, just takeaway points are spending time in nature. It doesn't have to be a huge, time sink, right? You can go out, you can sit next to a tree, you can hug a tree. I am often found tree hugging, actually. Just getting some sunlight on your face, like really just incorporating these things, these moments into your life and making them a priority. Yeah, I mean, every time you're doing that for yourself, you are building your microbiome and you're building your terrain, using experiences of joy, right, as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And as I said, I encourage everybody to check out The Dirt Cure, and we will stay tuned for what you have coming up next. Please keep us in the loop. And thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you.